He's had 8 kids, countless lovers, and even tried marriage, twice. But now, at 94, Clint Eastwood has revealed the one reason he'll never do it again. And it's not just bitterness. It's what he lost the last time he said, "I do." The first yes in a lifetime of no. At just 23 years old, Clint Eastwood married Maggie Johnson, a quiet, elegant college student he'd only known for a few months. It was 1953. He was handsome, ambitious, and still unknown to the world. She was thoughtful, reserved, and said yes before realizing what kind of life she was entering. To outsiders, it looked like the start of something solid. But Clint wasn't looking for stability. Not really. Even then, he resisted structure like rules, contracts, anything that made him feel boxed in. And marriage? That was just the first box he'd find a way out of. As Eastwood's career slowly took shape, the emotional distance between them grew just as fast. Clint would leave for roles, sometimes for months at a time. Maggie would stay home, raise their 2 children, and keep the silence. The connection between them became less about intimacy and more about inertia. They were still married, but mostly on paper. Friends later described the relationship as detached, like 2 actors running lines from different scripts. Maggie never challenged him, even when rumors of other women surfaced. She never gave interviews, never made scenes, but her silence wasn't strength. It was survival. She had married Clint before the fame, before the women, before the ego. By the time the spotlight hit, she was already being erased. By the 1960s, Eastwood had fully embraced the Hollywood lifestyle, including the affairs. Some were brief, others lasted for years. While still married to Maggie, Clint fathered children with other women. He didn't hide it. He just never spoke about it. There was no public meltdown, no scandal. Maggie didn't retaliate, didn't threaten divorce, didn't say a word. Instead, they arrived at a quiet, unspoken understanding. He would do what he wanted. She would remain the wife in the background. Some called it an open marriage. But it wasn't open in both directions. Clint was the one who wandered. Maggie, on the other hand, stayed put. Sandra Locke enters and everything changes. In 1975, Clint met Sandra Locke on the set of The Outlaw Josie Wales. She wasn't just another fling. She was younger, sharp, fiercely ambitious. She challenged him in ways Maggie never had. And Clint responded. He moved Locke into the home he once shared with his wife, even though he was still legally married. To Locke, it felt like the start of a real partnership. She was convinced Clint would finally divorce Maggie and marry her. What she didn't know was that Clint had already made up his mind. He was never going to marry again. Locke gave up her own rising career to be with him. She directed films, wrote scripts, poured herself into Clint's world. But over time, the same pattern returned. The warmth faded. The emotional walls went up. Clint became distant, then cold, then gone. She later called the relationship controlling and emotionally punishing. But at the time, she held on. Just like Maggie had. Maggie stayed legally bound to Clint for 26 years, through affairs, through children born outside their marriage, through Clint building a second home with another woman. She never spoke out, never fought him in public. Then, in 1979, she filed for divorce. The documents confirmed what the public had long suspected. Clint had fathered multiple children during the marriage, and the emotional bond with Maggie had been gone for years. Not only that, but he had moved the new mother into a separate property, one Sandra didn't even know he owned. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was strategic. When Sandra tried to assert her career independently, Clint used his power to shut doors behind her. Projects she pitched stalled, financing vanished, roles dried up. And when she pushed back, he ended the relationship by changing the locks on their home. She filed a lawsuit in 1989, not for heartbreak, but for breach of contract. She claimed Clint had destroyed her career. Warner Brothers eventually settled, but the damage was done. To the public, she was just another ex. To Clint, she was the one who challenged him the most, and paid the highest price for it. But even then, Maggie didn't drag his name through the press. She ended the marriage the same way she endured it, quietly. Clint's regret? Or just his nature? In later interviews, Clint offered a single explanation. "I was too young," he said, "too immature." But the truth was deeper. For Clint, marriage didn't represent love. It represented confinement, a legal structure that never matched how he actually lived. Maggie had tried to play the role, the supportive wife, the patient mother, the silent partner. But Clint didn't want a partner. He wanted freedom. And when that freedom clashed with commitment, he always chose the exit. The marriage to Maggie Johnson didn't just fail. It set a pattern Clint would repeat again and again. Emotional intensity in the beginning, followed by distance, then disappearance. He would never again commit on paper during the peak of his relationships, not with Sandra Locke, not with Frances Fisher, not with the woman who stood by him in his final decade. The lesson he took from Maggie wasn't just that marriage was hard. It was that, for him, it was incompatible with who he was. And from that moment on, he never pretended otherwise. Before Clint Eastwood became the man who couldn't stay, he was the boy who never got to. Born in 1930 at the height of the Great Depression, he grew up in motion. His family moved constantly, from San Francisco to Sacramento to Seattle, never settling, never unpacking. By the time he was a teenager, Clint had lived in over a dozen towns. Schools changed, friends disappeared. The only constant was starting over. His father, Clinton Sr., was a steel worker, quiet, disciplined, and emotionally remote. He provided but didn't connect. Clint later described him as a good man, but there was no warmth in the stories. No fond memories, just rules, distance, and a silent house. His mother, Ruth, was steadier, but even she couldn't anchor the family against the weight of uncertainty. That kind of childhood doesn't just shape a man, it teaches him how to disappear. By the time Clint turned 18, he had already developed a hard shell. He didn't trust easily, didn't rely on others. He learned to handle things alone, whether it was fixing a car, building a career, or walking away from someone before they got too close. Marriage, for most people, is about building something permanent. For Clint, permanence was what he never had, and deep down, never wanted. That fear of getting stuck, in one place with one person, locked into a version of himself he couldn't change, followed him into adulthood. It bled into every relationship he ever had. Even his early Army days reflected that mindset. Drafted during the Korean War, Clint avoided combat and spent most of his service moving between assignments in California. It wasn't about duty. It was about motion. He once said that the best thing about the Army was getting out. That line echoed in how he treated almost every relationship after. As Clint built his career, he leaned into roles that mirrored what he had learned as a kid. The lone drifter, the silent cowboy, the man who never needed anyone. He didn't just act that way. He lived it. He was admired for his independence, but behind that admiration was a man who had trained himself to need no one and mistrust those who tried to get too close. The idea of depending on someone, of needing them enough to legally bind his life to theirs, felt like weakness. And weakness was dangerous. People who got too close could leave. Or worse, they could stay and ask for more than he could give. But the blueprint was set long before fame. Long before he met Maggie Johnson, long before the affairs, the betrayals, the emotional walls, Clint Eastwood had already internalized one truth. Love was fine, as long as it didn't ask him to stop moving. That Depression-era rootlessness became part of his wiring. The emotional silence in his home became the blueprint for how he related to women. And the constant pressure to adapt, to never get too comfortable, left him always one step away from the exit. The other women. After Sandra Locke, Clint moved on to Franz Fischer, and if Sandra Locke was the storm, Frances Fisher was the calm that followed. She met Clint in the late 1980s, when both were starring in Pink Cadillac. There was no scandal, no public fight, no lawsuits. Just a quiet relationship that unfolded over 5 years, and brought a daughter into the world. Frances thought this one might be different. Clint was older now, quieter. They shared creative space, co-parented gently, and for a time it looked stable. But the pattern returned. As the intimacy deepened, Clint pulled away. Not with cruelty, but with silence. He stopped answering questions about the future. The idea of marriage was never even discussed, not seriously. Frances later said she had no illusions about who Clint was. And when the end came, it wasn't explosive, it was just over. They remained on civil terms for the sake of their daughter, but the relationship revealed something important. Even when Clint genuinely cared, even when he showed up as a father, he still couldn't stay present as a partner. Then came Dina Ruiz, the one who got the ring. This was in 1996. Clint Eastwood shocked everyone. At 65 years old, he married again. Her name was Dina Ruiz, a TV anchor he met while promoting Unforgiven. She was young, intelligent, charismatic, and didn't come from the Hollywood scene. For a moment, it seemed like Clint was rewriting his old rules. They had a daughter together, and Clint appeared more publicly affectionate than ever before. But beneath the surface, the pattern remained. Dina, unlike his previous partners, spoke openly about the challenges of being with Clint. In interviews, she described him as complicated, intensely private, and impossible to pin down. She once joked that he treated emotional conversations like tax audits, something to avoid until absolutely necessary. By the early 2010s, their marriage was under strain. Clint had returned to old habits, spending time away, avoiding confrontation, drifting emotionally. In 2013, Dina filed for divorce. The split was quiet, respectful, but telling. Even the one woman Clint married again couldn't keep him anchored. Looking across these women, Sandra, Frances, Dina, a pattern becomes undeniable. Clint Eastwood could love. He could commit his time, his energy, his fatherhood. But legal permanence, emotional vulnerability, anything that made him feel beholden to someone else, that was where he drew the line. Even when he tried, as with Dina, the structure of marriage eventually clashed with his deeper wiring. The man who grew up moving from town to town, who never felt at home in one place, simply didn't know how to belong to anyone for too long. Clint once said in an interview, "I believe in love. I just don't think love needs a contract." That wasn't a soundbite. It was a philosophy. Every woman got a different version, but the ending was always the same. Each of these women saw a different side of him. Sandra got the ambitious, powerful Clint. Frances got the gentler one. Dina got the older, slightly softened man. But all of them collided with the same wall the moment Clint stopped letting them in. Sometimes it came with betrayal. Other times, with silence. But it always ended the same way, with him pulling back and them realizing they were never going to be his wife. Not truly, because for Clint Eastwood, love was real. But marriage, even when he tried it again, always felt like something borrowed, never something he could own. Clint Eastwood never liked labels. Not husband, not even always boyfriend. But there's one title he never walked away from. Father. 8 children. 6 different women. No roadmap. No grand plan. Just Clint, creating lives while refusing to build the kind of family others expected. And yet, unlike in romance, where he disappeared, withdrew, or betrayed, he showed up for many of his kids. Not always in traditional ways, not always early, but when he did, he stayed. For years, the public only knew about a handful of Clint's children. He was private, almost secretive. His earliest children, Kimber, Kyle, and Allison, were born under the radar, outside of marriage, and largely raised by their mothers. The press either didn't ask or didn't dig. Clint never volunteered the truth, and for a long time, no one knew how many children he had. That changed in 2018, when he brought all 8 of them together for the first time, publicly at the premiere of The Mule. There was no speech, no explanation, just a photo. Clint, flanked by a full lineup of adult children, each from a different chapter of his life. It was quiet, understated, and said everything. He wasn't the kind of father who made declarations. He was the kind who just showed up. Eventually. The career reflections of Kyle and Allison. Kyle Eastwood, born in 1968 to Clint and Maggie Johnson, became a jazz musician. Allison Eastwood, born in 1972, pursued acting and later directing. Both grew up around their father's world but never claimed he was overly involved during their early years. Kyle once described Clint as a man who gave advice only when asked. Allison said in a rare interview, "He wasn't always around, but when he was, he made you feel like you were the only one in the room." There's a theme there. Clint didn't hover. He didn't parent with structure. But what he gave, when he chose to give it, was total presence. Not permanence, just focus. The kind of energy he never quite managed to give to his romantic partners. The secret daughter who changed the narrative. One of the most telling chapters came later in Clint's life, when a woman named Laurie Murray came forward, claiming to be his daughter from a relationship in the 1950s. Clint had allegedly never been told about her, but once the connection was confirmed, he didn't deny it. He welcomed her, quietly. No press release, no denial. Laurie became part of the family, not as a token, but as someone fully acknowledged. And that move, accepting a child he never knew long after the public had stopped asking questions, was something deeply Clint. He didn't fix the past. He just opened the door and moved forward. Clint Eastwood was more comfortable as a father than a husband. Not because he was always great at it, but because the expectations were different. Being a father allowed him to guide without being vulnerable, to lead without being tethered. It fit the role he knew best, the lone figure offering direction, not dependency. He once said, "Raising kids is about giving them space to become who they are, not who you want them to be." That might explain why he never lived in the same house as many of his children growing up, but still maintained long-term emotional bonds with them as adults. Marriage, by contrast, required Clint to be something he resisted, accountable to another adult, answerable. Marriage was a space where he couldn't be the only one who called the shots. With kids, he could love and still maintain control. With wives, he had to share the frame. Despite his refusal to conform, Clint's legacy is now visibly marked by his children. Some followed in his footsteps. Others built their own lives far from the screen. But all of them, in different ways, reflect pieces of him. Scott Eastwood, perhaps the most publicly known, looks and acts like his father's twin. Rugged, charming, a bit elusive. In interviews, Scott has said, "My dad's not a man of many words, but when he says something, you remember it." And that, more than anything, captures Clint's fatherhood style. Distant, sometimes inaccessible, but undeniably present when it counted. No one describes him as warm, but no one describes him as gone. Clint never needed a wedding to feel responsible for a child. He never needed to sign papers to care for someone he helped bring into the world. And maybe that's the contradiction that defined his life. A man who ran from one kind of commitment while embracing another. He didn't reject legacy. He just refused to build it through tradition. He didn't build a family in one home, under one roof. He built one across cities, generations, and timelines. One name, scattered across 8 lives. And in every one of those lives, even without the title of husband, Clint Eastwood left a mark that never left. The final chapter with Christina Sandera. Christina Sandera was there when the spotlight dimmed. She was the last to hold his heart, but not his hand. And when the crowds faded, the scandals quieted, and Clint Eastwood began counting years more than movies. She moved into his Carmel home in 2014. No press announcement, just a quiet relationship that lasted over a decade. And yet, even after 10 years together, Clint never asked her to marry him. Not when she became his closest companion. Not when she cared for him through aging hips and fading strength. Not even when her health began to fail first. Christina Sandera died in 2024. And when she did, she passed not as Clint Eastwood's wife, but as his partner, in every way except the one the law recognizes. They met at the Mission Ranch, the luxury inn Clint owned in Carmel. She was working as a hostess. He was long past needing to impress anyone. Their connection surprised people. She wasn't from the industry, wasn't chasing fame. She kept a low profile. But those who saw them together said it was the most peaceful Clint had ever seemed. There were photos of them out shopping, at quiet dinners, at his side during award shows, but there was never a wedding, never even a rumor of one. Friends said they talked about growing old, but never about rings. For once, Clint didn't run, he stayed, but he also didn't change. Why he stayed, and why he still said no. By the time Christina entered his life, Clint had already done it all. The fame, the scandal, the divorce. He had 8 children, multiple public relationships, and had once called marriage a trap, if you let it be one. But Christina never asked him to sign anything. She never pushed. She just lived beside him, not behind him. Their partnership looked like marriage. They shared a home, made decisions together. She helped raise one of his grandchildren. But when she passed away quietly in 2024, it was clear. Even this deep, consistent love couldn't shift Clint's belief. He had finally found someone who made him feel safe. But safety, to him, didn't mean surrendering his autonomy. Clint didn't release a statement when Christina died. There was no funeral live stream, no tribute in the papers. But those close to him noticed a shift. He stopped taking meetings, turned down events. The man who always seemed indestructible and who had outrun consequences and aging and heartbreak, suddenly looked tired. A close family friend told reporters, "He doesn't talk about it, but we see it. Christina was home for him." There's a cruel irony in that. Clint Eastwood spent a lifetime avoiding the word wife. But in the end, it may have been the woman he never married who came closest to what that word meant. For all the lovers who came before, Clint had always found a reason to walk away, or to build distance, or to claim he wasn't the marrying kind. But with Christina, he did the opposite. He stayed. He built a routine. He let someone see the quiet version of himself. And still, he didn't marry her. Not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't believe marriage had anything to do with love. For Clint, it had always been that way. The act of loving, showing up, protecting, offering time, mattered more than the ceremony. To him, marriage had always felt like performance. Love, he believed, didn't need that. And when Christina died, she died knowing that she had Clint Eastwood's heart, even if she never had his name. At 94, Clint has made peace with the fact that he will never marry again. But maybe the truth is, he never really did. Not in the way most people understand it. He gave his life to many women. But the love he gave them was always on his own terms. Fluid, flexible, and ultimately temporary. Except with Christina. She was the only one he grew old with. The only one he chose to stay with until the very end. And still, no vows. No rings. No promises. He had the children, the fame, the partners, the legacy. But Clint Eastwood never gave anyone his name. Not after Maggie. Love came and went, sometimes fiercely, sometimes quietly. But the ring never returned. And maybe that was the point. He didn't need marriage to love someone. He just needed space to do it his way. And at 94, Clint Eastwood isn't against love. He's just learned that love doesn't need a ceremony. And for him, it never did.